everyone, welcome back to the Israel Connection. I'm Esti Zenati, and my guest today is Jotam Confino. He is a Middle East correspondent and author based in Israel. He has covered the region for a variety of international outlets such as the Daily Telegraph, CBS News, BBC, USA Today, Daily Mail, The Times Radio. He also works for the Danish newspaper BT, which is the biggest online paper in Denmark. He holds a BA in International Studies and an MA in Security and Diplomacy. Yotam, thank you for joining me today.
My pleasure, Esti.
So, Yotam, you moved to Israel from Denmark in 2018 to become a Middle East correspondent. What drove that decision, and what did it feel like stepping into the region as a journalist and on a personal level?
So I was driven by a few things. I think the main reason why I moved here really was it was very hard for me to enter the Danish media, because the Danish media is very old school and rigid when it comes to allowing people to enter their world, really, or to become journalists.
Mm-hmm.
In Denmark, you have to go to journalist school because that's how you get an internship at a paper or radio channel or TV channel. And that's how you really get into the media world, and that's how you get a job. And I didn't go to journalist school. I have an academic background. I studied in Israel, Tel Aviv University, so it was practically impossible for me to even work for free in the Danish media.
Mm-hmm.
Which is why eventually I was very, very close to giving up. But I thought I was going to give it a shot by simply moving to Israel and trying my luck here, because I knew that here the rules are different. They allow people to work in journalism even if you haven't gone to journalism school. In fact, they value if you have an academic background, if you know something, especially about the Middle East. And I also wanted to come and live here again. I lived here for a year while I was studying at Tel Aviv University, and I loved it. And I thought I wanted to do it again. And, I have a connection to Israel. My father's Israeli, and I always wanted to cover the Middle East. So I thought this was a chance to try it. And that's essentially the two reasons why I ended up moving here and why I'm still here 7 years later.
So that brings me to my next question. What sparked your interest in the Middle East of all things?
So, when you have an Israeli background, it's almost impossible not to be confronted with Israel's history, Israel's culture, because even if you live in Denmark, Israel is often in the news. So I took a natural interest in it. I wanted to understand why they kept talking about the country where I come from, even when I was a teenager, and even younger than that when I was a kid. I remember seeing news about Israel, and I thought that's odd they talk so much about this country and about this conflict with the Palestinians. And when I became a teenager, I really got interested in stuff about the Middle East in general, mainly because my uncle is a very senior reporter in Israel. His name is Tzvi Bar-El. He works for Haaretz, and he's worked there for 40, 50 years at this point. And to me, he was a living legend. I thought he was not only a funny uncle, very funny and loving, but also super, super smart. I really looked up to him, and I could just tell from the way that he was writing that he knew so much about this region, and he was someone I looked up to. I thought if I could one day do a fraction of what he's been doing, then I would be very happy. So he's actually one of the reasons why the Middle East and covering the Middle East became such a focus for me.
Okay, so that answers some of my question for the next one. So we're good here.
Okay.
Other than your uncle, were there any other influences, like people, books, or experiences that helped shape your worldview or your approach for conflict reporting in general?
In terms of people, I think it's a good question, really. I haven't really thought that much about it, other than I remember, of course, seeing some of the TV reporters in Denmark back then reporting during the Second Intifada, for example. And I always thought, it looked like a really like a very difficult job, to be in a situation where you have essentially a warlike situation happening behind you, and you need to keep your head cool, you need to report and everything. So when I saw TV reporters, both in Danish but also on CNN or whatever, I always thought this looks like a really interesting job, and it was something that I was very much drawn to. But I also really was inspired by people who could write not only articles but also books about the Middle East. I remember reading a book by he was one of the he was a Knesset member actually and a leading left wing figure.
Mhm.
Avinari, his last name
Okay.
was, and I remember thinking, this is astonishing how much this person knows about this conflict. So I think that just generally seeing Israel and the Palestinian conflict so often, both on TV but also in newspapers, it just was something that really, for some reason, it piqued my interest because if you want to be a journalist, you need some sort of a conflict or a dilemma. There needs to be a story for you to tell. And this was the ultimate story, you know? You had
Yeah.
these two opposing sides, these two enemies, and there's so much history, religion, there's so much here that to me was just the perfect combination for a journalist to cover.
Okay. So you reported, on foreign outlets, especially Danish media. What has it been like covering Israel and Gaza for a European audience, especially since October 7th? And do you notice any different expectations or reactions from that audience compared to Israeli or American audience?
I think the Danish media is very similar to the rest of the Western media, really.
Mhm.
Maybe they're slightly more pro-Palestinian, but I think that after October the 7th,
Yeah.
maybe after October the 7th, I realized that something was wrong, because up until October the 7th, I could understand why most of the stories that were covered by the international media were usually very critical of Israel, because usually Israel had done something wrong, or they had, built a new settlement or whatever. It was often something Israel had done. But when it was the Palestinians' turn to be the bad guy, I realized that the media were just not going along with it. They just did everything in their power to avoid continuing to hold the Palestinians responsible for the war that they started. And it was a shock. It was a shock to me to see how the media so quickly forgot what had happened on October 7th and so quickly threw out journalistic integrity. And it was something that I learned very, very quickly,
Mhm.
and it was very overwhelming to me, and I realized that I didn't want to be part of it. I was here to tell the truth and to give fair coverage. And the minute that I started pushing back, I got a tremendous amount of hatred and threats and everything you can imagine. But I also got a large following, because
Mhm.
clearly I was not the only one who thought that. There were so many people, and to this day, so many people, especially in Denmark, I call them the silent majority, that are fed up with the lies that they're being fed on a daily basis, especially by the two public service channels. And they reached out to me and they kept following me. And to this day, it just keeps growing, the amount of people that follow me and want to, hear and see what I have to offer. So I felt like, I wasn't alone in seeing all of this, and I wasn't wrong. In fact, I've only that the further we get into this war, the more I feel like I'm absolutely right in the gut feeling that I had already, like a week into October the 7th.
Yeah, and you said silent majority. I mean, unfortunately, they've been really silent, like just to themselves, which I can understand in a way, but we need people to be more vocal out there.
I know, but it's for a reason. The reason why people are silent is
Yeah.
because this movement, which is largely built on hatred and racism and anti-Semitism, violence, they have effectively shut down millions of people who do not dare speak up against them. They don't want to, first of all, receive all the hatred that they will if they start speaking up on social media. And especially if you're Jewish, you're very careful. If you have kids, you're very careful with putting yourself out there. You don't want to become a target for these people. And this was their strategy all along. They wanted to be loud, violent, aggressive, shaming people who dared say anything about the Palestinians or about Hamas. And they were gaslighting immediately after October the 7th.
Yeah.
The accusations of genocide came a few days after October the 7th, and they've just continued to gaslight and to build that narrative and to shame anyone who dares, point out some of the factual inaccuracies that they have when they come out with their arguments about genocide, for example.
Do you, as a reporter and someone who works for the media, do you think that the international media has a hand in that? Because it feels like they have been extremely biased against Israel, like very
Yeah.
strongly, particularly since October 7th. And we see all the lies, on BBC and CBS and all these things. Do you think they fueled this thing?
They did. And I think the best way to summarize it is a few things that happened just in the past couple of days in Denmark.
Mhm.
I'll use Denmark as an example. On Sunday, you had a mass rally in
Right.
Copenhagen, and they gathered in front of Parliament. And there were open Hamas supporters, people walking around with flags of the Hamas spokesperson. People had T-shirts with "Death to the IDF." They were chanting loudly "Death to the IDF" in front of the Danish Parliament, and some of the extreme left-wing party leaders, or one of them at least, filmed it from inside Parliament, and you could clearly hear what was being chanted. He put it out on social media, and when I and other people pointed out what happened, uh, why he was putting something out that was essentially incitement to murder, he shamed those who dared say that to him, because saying it was insignificant. It wasn't really, it was just stupid slogans, and we should look at the genocide happening. And why am I mentioning this? Because in any normal world, all of this, especially having open Hamas supporters with big Hamas flags, people walking around in T-shirts with "Death to the IDF," masked people who are breaking laws in Denmark. Under normal circumstances, most media would be covering those aspects of this
Right.
march. They didn't. The two public service channels made it sound like people met and had like a hippie style kumbaya gathering where they were just peaceful and loving, and all they wanted was to care for the Palestinian civilians, which was the furthest from the truth. They were so hateful, so loud, so racist, and so violent, and barely any of the media covered that. So yes, this is an example of how the media is directly responsible for gaslighting and downplaying the significance of such big problems that we have in our society. That's one example. And the second example I wanted to mention is that just today, the biggest public service channel in Denmark did
Mhm.
another interview with a UN representative who blatantly lied about, first of all, the amount of aid coming into Gaza. He said a handful of trucks enter Gaza on a daily basis. He said Gaza is the worst thing he's seen in the past 20 years. Noted that Bashar al-Assad murdered 500,000 people, gassed them, executed them.
Yeah. What's going on in
So
Sudan all the time, these recent
the
years.
famine in Sudan, all he's going against what the UN themselves are saying. And what do the journalists do? Instead of challenging him, instead of holding him responsible to the blatant lies, they just repeat it. They just press it, and they just publish it as fact. And this is just one tiny example. Has been going on for 2 years straight now.
Mhm.
And this is, to me, being directly responsible for the misunderstanding by most people about what's happening in Gaza. Because if you rely on two public service channels to give you the information, I understand why you think that Israel is definitely committing genocide. Why you would think that Israeli soldiers are almost cheerfully going out and executing children, because why wouldn't they? They wake up every day and that's what they want to do. And this, to me, is not only a failure of journalism, it is being directly responsible for fueling the hatred and the violence that we're seeing across the entire West, with people going on the streets chanting "Death to the IDF," and instead of covering it, you downplay it or you don't even report it at all.
Yeah, it seems like a lot of journalists and media, they have lost integrity. They report on one side and they amplify times 100 and make it look like it's the end of the world in one little place, ignoring everything else outside of it. And I mean, why do you think that's happening? Why do they do that? Why is it so hard for them to actually provide real facts to their audience?
Because a lot of the journalists are so emotionally involved in this, even though they have no stake in the conflict at all.
Yeah.
People were accusing me of being impartial by the sheer fact that I'm half Israeli. a lot of people still to this day, as if I can't report on it. But they have no problem with people, journalists, who have no stake in the game, who don't even live here, who are so emotionally and involved in this that they will break down crying on TV. They will, they will sit on TikTok and go through all of these horrible images from Gaza and declare that they can't follow this anymore because it's too much for them, and they believe that Hamas and Israel are basically the same. These people who are not journalists but activists, these people have so many emotions involved in this, and they have such hatred for Israel that it's impossible for them to go in here and try to do a fair job. Look, I'm
Right.
all for the journalists speak up their mind. I do it myself every single day. I have no problem with it. But if you don't cover the war in a fair manner, if you spend 90% of your time vilifying Israel, reproducing unverified claims by Hamas, and if you don't challenge what the NGOs are saying, as the public service channel in Denmark, for example, then you are not giving a fair coverage of the war. If anything, your main focus should be on the terror organization that started this
Yeah.
war and that still holds hostages held inside Gaza and that use civilians as human shields. But it's not just the journalists, it's the NGOs. And the reason why I'm so furious with the NGOs is that they are supposed to be our ears and eyes inside Gaza. They're the ones who's supposed to want what's best for the civilians. If I wanted that, if I was somebody who worked for an NGO in Gaza, I would try to tell the world about what Hamas is doing, how Hamas are using the hospitals that we are also operating in. None of them have said anything.
No.
Imagine doctors and nurses that completely ignore that you have a terror group exploiting the very building that you're in. And instead of telling the world about it, you vilify the country, the army that's trying to evacuate you, to get you to safety, and to destroy the terror organizations that's using your facility, committing double war crimes. It's like an upside world. So that's
Yeah.
why when I see the NGOs on it every single day vilify Israel, and you don't hear anything about Hamas, that is enough for me it's proof enough for me that they don't have the right intentions, and they are such a big part of the war that you cannot consider them neutral in any capacity.
Exactly. And I think one of the main examples recently for that is the so-called famine in Gaza that they've been talking about constantly, social media, using pictures of kids who have degenerative diseases and all sorts of fake pictures, but they keep ignoring the videos of actual hostages starving to death in the tunnels.
It's
And
yeah, go on.
no, go on. It's okay.
No, I just want to say it's a great example. Again, you don't have to lie to tell the world how bad it is in Gaza. Any person in their right mind, unless you're an extremist, you know that the people in Gaza are suffering. We can tell. You don't have to make up stories. You don't have to take a child who's clearly sick with all kinds of other diseases
Yeah.
and to put that child on the front page of your paper as a proof of famine. You don't have to do that. I don't understand the need to go out and lie or to mislead. I don't understand it. To me, it's like it's so bad you don't need to lie. But the minute you start lying about all of these things, that's when people start losing faith in what it is that you're saying.
Right. Yeah, it looks like that's been the system of those big newspapers and big media outlets that used to be reliable back in the day. They used to be the go-to for people to get information from, knowing that this is going to be fair journalism and fact reporting and the whole thing. And now it's all lies, it seems. And it's very easy to prove them wrong, which is ridiculous. The fact that they don't even look into it or try to provide people with the fact, it's just ridiculous.
It is. I would also say that Israel plays a part in this because Israel has made one of the biggest mistakes ever by continuing to shut the borders for international journalists, because it allows Hamas to control the narrative. It allows Hamas to get away with literal murder. And instead of having, internationally recognized journalists who, yeah, some of them are clearly biased, but you know that if they were in there, they would also be able to debunk some of the claims because, if there's no evidence, they can't report on it. And if they're in there, they have all, possible ways of going to verify if 90 people were killed or if, every day 100 people are massacred at aid sites, but because they're not there, the lazy journalism is saying, well, Israel is shutting off the borders, so we just rely on whatever the Hamas health ministry is saying and the NGOs who whitewash what Hamas is saying. And then we have some eyewitnesses, usually anonymous, and then we have journalists on the ground who are more often than not Hamas propagandists. And that combination just doesn't give you the right picture of what's happening inside Gaza. And that is entirely on Israel. Israel could have and should have opened their borders, and they could have said, listen, if you want to go in here, most of Gaza is a war zone. If you want to go into certain areas on the front line, you need to be embedded with us the very same way that you would if you went to Ukraine, or Russia, or Congo, or whatever. But there are other places where you can walk around freely. You don't need to be embedded with us. But again, it's your responsibility. We're not responsible for your lives in there. Clearly, we can't target you. But if you are killed in a collateral damage because you are close to an area where it's full of Hamas, that's war, And I would say that would have been better for Israel, even though they would have been vilified the minute that a white Western CNN journalist would have been killed. It would have still been better because they were there on their own, on their own responsibility, basically.
Yeah, I think that's the problem. I think Israel knows that if they allow journalists to go in freely, that no matter how many contracts a journalist sign, how many times they tell them this is your responsibility, Israel will be blamed for it every single time if something happens. And I know there have been a few journalists, particularly I think in the beginning, that went in with the IDF. They went in to see the tunnels after they've been cleared. They did some reporting in there, and I can only imagine it takes a while to get permits to do that and to go with the IDF. That's the Israeli bureaucracy for you, but it's still possible if they want to. But I know some journalists refuse to do that. They want to go by themselves.
Yeah, but again, if Israel said there are certain areas you can go, but there are front lines where you need to be embedded, the international journalists and all of the unions know that they could not, there's no way that they could say to Israel, what you're doing is in violation of X, C, and Y, because it's the exact same terms as in Ukraine. Gaza is just smaller, so it does seem like you have less areas to cover or to be in, because many of the places are actual front lines. But if Israel had allowed journalists to be in southern Gaza in the beginning of the war, and other areas, they would have had, I would say, first of all, less condemnation, and international journalists would also have been less angry with Israel. I think the reason why so many journalists a long time ago turned completely and literally just took a step onto the Palestinian side is because they are so fed up with Israel's bureaucracy and not allowing them to go in there. So it's kind of like their revenge in a way. Like, you know what? If you don't allow us to go in, we will reproduce whatever Hamas says because you leave us no option. So this is, I would say, one of the major mistakes that Israel did from the beginning of the war.
I think there's one particular journalist, I guess I'll call him, that he's been talking about this constantly, which is Piers Morgan. And I know you were on his show. He's been very controversial recently, particularly, and he's been pointing that out time and time again, but then he refuses to say, like, to see the big picture. He has all these anti-Israel, anti-Semitic guests on his show. And I know you got a chance to go there and argue with one of them. What was that like for you?
Look, I think, first of all, it's a major platform, and I'm happy that he invited me. I used to hold Piers Morgan in very high regard, but I agree. I also am disappointed with him platforming Nazis and Holocaust deniers and whatnot. I'm very disappointed. I think he did a good job in the beginning of the war, and actually, I don't remember exactly, but there was a solid year or so where he had guests on from both sides, and he was trying to challenge all of them. But lately, I know that a lot of people have just been blocked and have not been allowed to go on his show anymore. To me, being on with the Al Jazeera guy was a challenge because I barely got any time to speak, and the other guy got 15 minutes unhindered where he could just lie and yap and say whatever he wanted. It was a very sensitive topic because we were talking about one of his colleagues who was killed. So I understand the sensitivity, and I don't think that Piers did anything wrong really in inviting him on. I would just say that unfortunately I would have liked more time to challenge the countless lies that he came with. But this is just the name of the game today. It's very difficult. The fact that I'm even still working for so many, especially British media, TV and radio channels, to me is proof, at least for me, that I could still do my job. I'm not being cancelled or editorialized. But in Denmark, unfortunately, I have been cancelled by the two main public service channels, which is extremely sad because I've done nothing but being helpful to them, literally working my ass off for both of those channels for years. So it's really sad that it's come to that point where in my own country I can't even go on the main radio and TV channels. They don't want to have anything to do with me, even though I'm the only Danish journalist in Israel currently, the only one. But it's okay for me to go on BBC or the Times Radio or whatever. It is just so ridiculous. But to me, again, it just shows that there's so much wrong with the media, international media, but also definitely Danish media. And I am simply refusing to shut up. And I will do everything I can to push back against this insane upside world that we've gotten into because of people's irrational hatred for Israel.
Yeah, it's been upside down is like an understatement. It's been really, really crazy to see all these people that normally you would think they would be against Hamas, against terrorism. All of a sudden they glorify them, they cheer for them. And I think because of that, we've been having issues with getting hostage deals and all of these because Hamas thinks that they have the upper hand, they're in power. So why would they agree to any deal?
It's a very good point. And unfortunately, Hamas, they're right. They made many mistakes, Hamas. Yahya Sinwar didn't calculate properly with what he was doing on October the 7th in terms of military successes. He should have had Hezbollah 100% joining him, not 60%, 100%. He should have had Iran 100% backing, also attacking Israel, because their goal was to annihilate the state of Israel. Their goal was to commit genocide, period. And they succeeded not in that, but they did succeed in isolating Israel more than it's ever been isolated. Of course, Israel helped getting there because they have a government with ministers who say the most insane things because they're speaking to their bases and they don't understand that whatever they say will be amplified times 10 in the international media. It will be headlines everywhere. If Hamas says we'll commit October 7th massacre again, it might be a headline here and there, but nobody cares. So
they've been saying that.
Yeah, though they keep saying it, but how often have you heard the media talk about this?
Never.
That's the thing. Hamas can quite literally get away with saying anything. Right now, they're calling on civilians in Gaza City to stay in Gaza City and go down with the ship with them. They're essentially calling on every civilian in Gaza City to be murdered along with them. They did the same thing at the beginning of the war when Israel tried to evacuate northern Gaza. And nobody seems to make this a story and to sit in TV studios and talk about what's going on here. There's a terrorist organization in there that we know have done all of these bad things, but now they are trying to prevent people from leaving a zone that's going to be an area that's going to be a war zone. And they're sabotaging the GHF, the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation's work every day. These stories should be major headlines. But if you go to most of the big media's websites and you scroll under their Israel Hamas category, I guarantee you 80 or 90% of it will be stories where there's an anti-Israel or Israel critical angle. And it's rarely anything about what Hamas has done, said, or why we're even here to begin with.
Yeah, you only see these stories on Israeli and Jewish media and occasionally maybe New York Post, Fox News, maybe. like, these outlets, but never on the vast majority of them around the world,
Yeah.
which is, it's sad.
Yeah, it is. Israeli media, I would say, have also failed in certain regards, but generally, if you compare journalism coming from Gaza to journalism done in Israel, it's two worlds apart. And for a very obvious reason. Hamas does not allow free press or free speech. So if you want to be a hero and cover what Hamas is doing, cover that they're firing rockets from within civilian areas and they're hiding under hospitals. If you're a hero and you want to do that kind of journalism, you'll most likely get killed. So that's why you don't see actual proper journalism coming from there. But if you look at Israel, there are certain things that they fail on, in my opinion. They don't show the Israeli public to the extent that that the Palestinians are actually suffering. Because, and I understand to some extent why, because they know that their first priority is to show sympathy for the families of the hostages and for the Israelis who are fighting in there. And it can be almost provocative to show the other side, but it's not journalism. If you don't show that side as well, first of all, you're failing in journalism and you're not showing the public what they need to know about what's happening in Gaza. But other than that, I would say the Israeli media have some of the best journalists in the world. They have extremely high standards. They have toppled prime ministers. They are savage in their criticism of Israel, of the army, of anything you can think of. It is such a high standard compared to what's coming out of Gaza that you can't even compare the two. It's two different worlds. One is mainly propaganda, and the other is, at least in some respects, extremely good journalism.
Yeah. I mean, it's interesting to see, like, someone who watches the Israeli news occasionally, I see obviously the different types of reporting. There's, in Israel, there are a few, like three, I think, major channels, and one of them is more for the government, the other one is more against, and then there's one in the middle. It's interesting to see the difference in reporting on all of them, but I think in general, they all have really strong journalists.
Completely. Look, if you want to talk about being critical of Netanyahu, you can't find a Western media that's as critical of Netanyahu than some of the Israeli media. They destroy him every single day. And so, I think that that's, again, a testament to the difference between a democracy, Israel, and an area that's essentially an Islamist dictatorship run by a terror group. And the fact that people still try to compare the two as if they're equal is insane to me. There's a Danish activist, I would call him. He's not a journalist, but he's an activist who argued that because we always say and label the health ministry in Gaza as Hamas run, we should always also say that the health ministry in Israel is run by a government whose prime minister is he's now accused of war crimes. He also said,
oh my God.
He also, look, this is a guy who's supposedly respected. He's trash in my opinion, but he also said that the Taliban, and you could compare the Taliban and Israel when it comes to propaganda and lies. Why should you believe Israel more over the Taliban? These kinds of people who, in my opinion, have zero journalistic integrity, are horrendous at their job. They're everywhere. It's not just Denmark. It's the United States. It's the UK. It's Germany. Every country, they've got those very holier than thou journalists who hate Israel with such passion that they get away with saying the most insane things. Quite literally, the most ridiculous things you can come up with, they get away with it because it's just whatever. It's just Israel bashing. Nobody cares.
Yeah, they made hating Israel their personality. That's what they are. That's all they do.
Yeah, at least some of them. Then you have other people
them,
who, then you have other people who really just try to steer clear of all of this. They're not on social media. They just go in, do their job, and they leave. And some of them do a good job. Mostly those who have a base here. If you don't have a base here, if you're not here, if you come every 3 months for 2 weeks and go in and out, you have no clue what's happening. You're completely out of touch. And if you don't speak the language, especially on the Israeli side, you're also out of touch. There's so many of these journalists who are flying in and out who have no clue what the hell is happening here. They read a few headlines, they scour over the Israeli English media, and then they go on and report it as their own. They just recycle whatever's written on the Israeli English media, which is just trash, you know?
Yeah, and that's why I really respect journalists like Douglas Murray, for example, who's been there for months and he's been covering the war since the beginning. The same thing he did in Ukraine and Russia, and he knows what he's doing. He's going there and seeing it with his own eyes. He's speaking to the people on the ground. I believe he went into Gaza with the IDF multiple times, and then people like Piers Morgan and the ridiculous guests he had on his show ridiculed Douglas Murray and people like him that actually say you have to go and see it with your own eyes. You have to be there before you speak everything against it. But yeah, I mean, it just shows how people are biased and they refuse to see anything else other than what they have in their minds.
Yeah. A person like Douglas is a great example of someone who dared go against the mainstream, dared call out the hypocrisy from day one, who's extremely eloquent, who keeps his cool, who knows his stuff, who's a historian, and who can argue against any person, really.
Yes.
And of course he's pro-Israel. Yes, he's taken a stand. It's clear, but so has Al Jazeera. And so many other journalists have clearly taken a stand, writing, signing letters against the Israeli government or whatever. So if they're allowed to be clearly taken aside, he's most definitely allowed to take a side.
Mm-hmm.
I think you should try to avoid taking a clear side. When people say, are you pro-Israel? I'm saying I'm pro-Israel because I live in this country and I want this country to survive. And in terms of the war, of course, I'm pro-Israel over pro-Hamas. But I'm not anti-Palestinian. It's not like I don't want the Palestinian civilians to have a good life. I wish they could have a good life. I wish they could be rid of this fanatic, insane cycle of violence, hatred, Islamism, and anti-Semitism that has just poisoned their culture for decades. These children have gotten the hatred from their parents. They've gotten it from their parents, and they've never managed to break out of it. And I feel really terrible for the civilians and for the children. But to be anti-Hamas is not to be anti-Palestinians, and I think a lot of people really confuse those two things.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's very tough to sometimes it's very tough to separate the two, because you see in the beginning, after October 7th, the majority of Palestinians celebrated. They went to the streets, they celebrated, they threw candy, it was a big day for them. And a lot of them went on social media and posted all these happy videos. So it's tough to kind of separate the two, but I think they've been conditioned to that. This is what Hamas has been doing, and the people before them, for decades. They have been radicalized to the point that every little toddler thinks Israel is the enemy. We have to murder Jews. That's their thing. Do you think there's a way, or do you think there's even a chance to de-radicalize them, to take that ideology away from them and make a better life for them, for their children, at least?
I think there is a way. First of all, the minute Hamas is somehow removed from Gaza and there's some sort of moderate Palestinian/Arab governance in there, and the minute that money starts pouring in and they start rebuilding schools and all that, there needs to be a system in place, a rigorous system where you supervise the teaching materials in schools in a much, much better way than you have with UNRWA, because UNRWA has gotten away with, for decades, indoctrinating and radicalizing Palestinian children. The European Union knows about it. Every single year they come to condemn it. Nothing happens. So you need to take this fanatic, horrible institution and throw them out of Gaza, because they are part of the problem. Clearly, if you run the education material in the most radicalized place on earth, you probably did something wrong. So it's time for them to go. It's time for some of the moderate Arab countries to help with education, to help creating new school books, and to have anti-Israel bodies like the UN and other organizations be overseeing this, because they will not oversee anything. We've
No.
seen what they've done; they failed. So you have to have moderate, Western really countries overseeing this in coordination with the Arab countries to make sure that what they're being taught is not to hate and kill Jews. At the same time, I would also say the Israeli education system could also probably be use a little brush up. There are certain areas where we know for a fact that they're being taught, not good things for kids. Let's just put it like that. Some Israeli kids have also been taught that Arabs are an enemy, and that's just wrong. They need to understand that we have to break the cycle of hatred, and it starts now. It'll likely take generations before we actually really see the improvement, but you need to start somewhere, and now is the time to start.
I think what you said about Israel, I think if it is being taught, it's probably in like more extreme schools, but in general, in the public schools, we were not taught that. I mean, as someone who went to school in Israel, we were never taught that the Arabs are bad, they're the enemies. They taught us history and the fact of what happened in Israel throughout the years, since the very, very beginning, since the Bible days, since the whole thing. So, but yeah, I mean, obviously, extremism in general should not be existing.
No.
But unfortunately, it exists in every culture. But these are just the fringe people. This is not the main
No.
thing in Israel. And on the other side, that's the main. Unfortunately, that's the main thing that's happening. Is taking over everything. So yeah, what is like? What is the mood in Israel right now? I know there have been some protests, obviously, and people are calling for the release of the hostages. There have been over 400,000 people in Tel Aviv protesting last night. What do you see there as being there right now?
I feel like people are really, 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 really fed up with the war on so many levels. There's obviously the most dire situations, the hostages, but there's also, stay at home moms, or, families that don't have their father for 80% of the year because
Yeah.
he's in Gaza or he's in Lebanon or whatever. Families that fall apart, people who are being fired from their jobs. I know that for a fact. People have been fired because they've been in and out of reserve so much that the companies had to let them go, even though you can't do that in Israel. But they find an excuse, and they fire them because it's not sustainable for them. This has taken such a toll on the Israeli society that this war needs to stop soon. They need to wrap it up, and if they want to go into Gaza City, it's not something that can take a year. It's destroying the economy. It's destroying people's minds, and it's destroying Israel in the international system. So I'm feeling a lot of anxiety, or I'm sensing a lot of anxiety in the Israeli atmosphere, and an impatience. People want this to be over.
Yeah. Yep. I think that's what the international audience or crowd, whatever you call them, they don't understand. They think that Israelis want to be at war at all times, and it's just not the reality. We want the hostages to be back, and we want this to end, because at the end of the day, we suffer. Our people suffer every single day. We lose our soldiers. We lose hostages are dying. They're on the brink of dying, and we don't want that to happen. Those who are left, still alive. Do you feel hopeful about the future in the region at all? And what do you think is going to happen in the next few years?
Yeah. So other than the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, but if you look a bit broader, I'm quite positive. Hezbollah is, like I said, made a huge mistake on October the 8th by not going full force against Israel. They are in a horrific condition militarily. Generally, their entire organization is in shambles. That's great. That's great news for Israel. That's good for Lebanon. Bashar al-Assad is gone. That's also good. I'm not sure about the new regime. Obviously,
We'll
they're
see.
extremists. No, he's in a jihadist in a suit, and his forces have been committing massacres. It remains to be seen if he can actually unite the country. I'm not so sure about Syria. Iran is also much weaker now than it has been in decades, and I believe Israel is going to probably finish the job in terms of their nuclear program. And I believe that once the war in Gaza is over, Israel will normalize ties with with countries like, for example, Saudi Arabia and other countries. So I believe that there is a reason to be positive in certain aspects of the region, but in terms of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, because the war is not even over, it's hard to be positive about something. It has to
Yeah.
be over before you can start thinking in positive terms, I think.
Yep, that's true. All right, so before we go, I have this little segment I usually do. It's called My Favorite Israeli Thing.
Okay.
So who is your favorite Israeli reporter or journalist?
Oh, I think it's Ronen Bergman. I've loved his reporting for years. He's, to me, sublime, not only because he knows so much about particularly the Mossad, but also the Israeli army. He's been reporting on the highest level for decades. He wrote probably one of the best books ever written on Israeli military and intelligence operations. And he's just got his sources well placed. To me, he's the ultimate Israeli journalist.
All right. Who's your favorite Israeli historical figure?
That's a good question. Who I like personally, or who I think is like,
Who do you
was,
like? Who do you connect with the most? Who do you maybe, who
yeah.
inspires you?
I think someone like Yitzhak Rabin.
Mhm.
I think he's a obviously many Israelis would say that, but to me, even though I wasn't born then, if we can talk about people who generally have lived and then today,
Yeah.
like people who lived that I never unfortunately got to really experience, but that I've read about, I think Yitzhak Rabin was exceptional. I think he was just a legend in so many ways. He left a mark and he had integrity. He resigned after it came out that his wife had a bank account in Washington. Imagine having to resign over that. And today you have a prime minister who's on trial in 3 different corruption cases, accused of bribery, breach of trust, all these things. He resigned over his wife's bank account in Washington. To me, that was integrity. And generally, he was just like a proper sabra, someone who I believed also, and he did make peace. So to me, he's like a really an iconic figure in Israeli history.
Do you think he would do things differently today?
Yeah, for sure. I don't
Yeah.
think he would. I think he would have ended the war a while ago. He would also 100% not have sat in a government with extremists like Ben Gvir and Smotrich. He would have had, hopefully, a relatively normal Israeli cabinet with ministers with integrity who wouldn't go out and rile up the whole world by saying all these insane things that they do. The damage that these people have caused is insane. I don't think Rabin would have been in a government like that. And I believe he would have managed to keep Israel's allies close. And he would have probably ended the war, I believe, a while ago.
All right. Who's your favorite Israeli collaborator?
Collaborator?
Yes.
You mean someone I work with?
Someone you got to work with, yes.
Oh, someone I got to work with.
Mm-hmm.
That's a good question. You mean in terms of Israeli journalists or?
Yeah, anything. Yeah, in your field,
In
someone
my
you got to
field?
work with. Yes.
Yeah, okay. So I've worked a bit with I wouldn't really call it working, but I have a good relationship with a Channel 12 reporter called Karen Bezalel. She's very kind. She's extremely good. And she's just an excellent journalist. And we've helped each other from time to time with many things throughout the years. And if there's anything I need help with, she's always there. So she's a very, very good, I would say, journalist, but also a good colleague for somebody like me.
All right. And lastly, what is your favorite Hebrew word or expression?
Well, I'm not sure if I should say that. It's such a thing that everyone says here. It's here. It's not controversial at all. Everyone says it. Kusachtak is like something
Yeah.
that it just came from my dad and everyone in his generation, and I still hear it. I still hear it everywhere. I know it's a really bad word, but it's to me. I don't. When I say it, I don't mean what it actually means. It's just
No,
a
it's like
word.
it's like a term of frustration. Like you're
Exactly.
frustrated with something. Yeah.
My brother and I always start our conversation like that because he finds the word hilarious as well.
Yeah, we say kusemek.
Yeah, because I don't know where the kusach that came from. I think that's the Arabic
Yeah, so it's
influence.
Arabic. So yeah, Kasachtak speaks about a sister, and then the other one speaks about your mom. But
There you go.
that's yeah, yeah. Wait, yeah. Don't
It's
learn
so,
from us.
you know what? It's so primitive, but you know what? If you ask people in the UK, they would say, "Well, I like saying motherfucker or cocksucker
Yeah,
or whatever." It's not that much better, really. So I
right.
think generally these kinds of words are always bad, but to me, it just sounds funny, and I just to me, it's my favorite word.
Okay. That's the first one. That's a good one. I like it. All
Great.
right, Yotam, thank you so much for being here. It's been a pleasure talking to you.
Thank you for having me.
Thanks, and thank you all for listening. Until next time.